going on, everybody? I'm back with another video. Today's video is going to be talking about Manchester City versus Tottenham and the tactics that were implemented in this Premier League match between the two sides. And so this is going to be made using Keyframe again, just excellent software for all coaches, players trying to learn more, teach more about the game, creating content. But let's get right into it. And there'll be a blog coming out about this and some of the other Premier League games later tonight, so be on the lookout for that. I'll put the link in the description when they're out, but let's get right into it. So Manchester City's, we can look at their build-up shape first. They played with two central defenders, and then they played also with inverted fullbacks. Now Zinchenko and Cancelo, they had a bit different roles when they inverted, but a lot of times it was very similar. Cancelo looked like he inverted a little bit more and had a little more versatility going forward, but Zinchenko often mirrored him on the weak side, creating this 2-3 build-up shape. And with the fluidity of Manchester City, it did vary quite a bit, but this was the basic shape and more or less the starting points for the players. And then the occupation between the lines went with three players, often with the false nine, with Jesus dropping between the lines and out of the control or the influence of the defensive line from Tottenham. And then we have our players creating with Sterling and Foden, and they were more or less in charge of creating height for the team and width. And we can see here the use of minimum width, which is essentially the concept of not using more of the width of the field than is needed. So essentially this is just to promote a faster defensive transition and and to make the passing lines shorter so the ball can move quicker, but still taking advantage of the adequate amount of space. Now for Spurs, we'll look at their shape. Spurs played, I might use a different color for them. I'll use black just so it's really distinct. So Spurs played a 4-2-3-1, and as they moved deeper, it moved to a 4-4-2 shape. And this was often influenced by the players between the lines, and City did a really good job of the movements between the lines, threatening in behind and creating opposite movements between players. And what I mean by opposite movements is, so when a player would threaten a deeper area or a higher area in behind, a player would be then there between the lines to take advantage of the space. So they put Tottenham into lose-lose situations and use the defensive structure against them. So these were the basic shapes at play, and we'll look at one quick rotation example, the fluidity of Manchester City and how they influenced the build-up, or how they influenced Tottenham in order to progress the ball. So right away we can see the player moving in, Zinchenko driving with the ball more narrow, and now it looks like Gundogan moves out wide just to balance out the shape, so with these counter movements. And then we also have players going in behind while players come deeper. So these are just two situations, and I can highlight the players individually. Two situations where one player runs higher when one checks deeper, and one moves wider when one becomes more narrow. And this often manipulated the Tottenham defensive shape to put them more narrow and over compact, or it extended them and broke the connections to undo the compactness. And then the transition that City had to control was primarily through Kane as the target man in transition. Target man meaning he was the player they were looking for in order to play and progress through. So we had the Manchester City W formation in their rest defense shape, and this pretty much put three the holding midfielder and the two inverted fullbacks really close to the outlets, the first line outlets of the midfielders of Tottenham, as well as it created numerical advantage as in the center back position between the two center backs and Harry Kane, and it allowed players like Son to be marked well in advance before he was even making his run. So that is very important to note as we move forward. And then here we're going to look at a transition right away. So the ball is recovered through the right fullback of Tottenham, as highlighted here. And then right away we have the shape for Manchester City, the holding midfielder and two inverted fullbacks. And then they have quick access to the ball through Zinchenko after possession is lost. And Zinchenko has cover from Rodri and Cancelo in the same connected line with numerical advantage of two players covering, both center backs covering in the blind spots of these players to then protect against a direct ball. And then if the ball is played short, they also have players coming to back press and help with the numerical advantage that just Tottenham have around the ball in this moment. So now when the ball is won, possession is established through Tottenham, we can see now Manchester City players tracking runs through Zinchenko as he follows a run into a deeper area. Rodri steps to attempt to prevent any further progression, while the two center backs become more connected, more narrow to block off the center corridor, which is the most direct route to goal. And then now we'll see Son and Cancelo drop as well. So Cancelo has a few yards on Son already, just to be safe that the ball isn't beaten in behind right away. And now, worst case scenario, there was a few situations where the counter press was broken, and we see right away the two center backs get connected very narrow, control the center corridor, and now the fullbacks are a bit stretched. So their first priority is first tracking the runs, and then once these runs have been made and they have to reset, then their priority will be established in connecting back with the center backs and then becoming a little bit more space oriented. And now we see the players from Manchester City just back pressing and looking to get into a better defensive position, while Rodri is in charge of Harry Kane on the ball. And now we can see that a little bit about Tottenham here. Harry Kane is on the ball, obviously, and now we see players like Son making runs into the half space, and same with Lucas Moura, was more of a central threat, and then with the players on the weak side wide area, they would also be prioritizing the targeting of the half space to take advantage of these loose connections between center backs and fullbacks. But these loose connections weren't overstretched for very long, as Manchester City were very well organized and were aware of the threat that Tottenham possessed. So now we see players around the ball for Manchester City, and the situation looked under control. We'll see in a minute. There is a few instances of individual skill to then break the counter press, a bit of press resistance from players like Harry Kane, but then we see the control that Manchester City had when controlling Son and when Harry Kane was on the ball, to protect the space in behind the defense. And then we also see Manchester City, when they end the transition phase, they look to establish their defensive structure with their wide players dropping, and then they'll move into more of a 4-4-2 and then slowly step out to then press and win the ball back. But around the ball, we see Son and Lucas running more, starting the half spaces, making runs narrow, and then players like Lamela arriving a little bit later because he was a bit deeper around the ball of Harry Kane, but very short of options, and his field of view is well controlled by City, until a little individual skill, which happens, but ultimately doesn't lead to much, because even with the break of the counter press, there's such good support and connections made from the defensive line that one, the players from Manchester City know where to press the ball to the outside, and they control the center areas, while the players deeper from the ball, or higher from the ball, I should say, are dropping back, so the ball is forced into an inefficient area, into the wide corridor, while the back four create connections very compact horizontally to then control threats in behind with players like Son and Lucas Moura and Lamela making runs into the half space, and primarily goal-oriented runs. So very rarely do we see players like Son make their first move inward and then outward and then back in. So these runs were very much, the player would make a run like Son did, wide first and then goal-oriented. They didn't very much switch it up to narrow the defense and take advantage of the width. So just a little note, when City do get broken in the counter press, the spaces they leave are through the wide corridors rather than the half spaces and the central corridor. So then we see Harry Kane is just left with nowhere to go, and Cancelo is able to put a tackle in a 1v1 situation. So now, moving back to Manchester City in possession, we have Tottenham in their 4-4-2 because they've moved into their low block, so their lines become flatter and more vertically and horizontally compact. So we have our 4-4-2 shape. You can't see the left fullback in this position, but it's also worth noting the midfield structure of Manchester City in the two holding midfielders, which is really connected to the Zinchenko out wide, but he's in the wide corridor. So in this situation, the two holding midfielders, Rodri and Cancelo, and then now we have our players between the lines, the three players, then connected at the base. So we can even take away the holding midfielders, because in this match, the three players were very much, they had different roles and played these roles differently, but for the most part, their biggest advantage was their use in controlling the offensive transition from Tottenham. So while the players between the lines are where the chances were created, and now we'll see how Sterling will get on the ball and how the players between the lines can influence the players of Tottenham through their defensive shape. So especially with Stones stepping out to progress the ball through dribbling, this is a key situation that often pulls players from deeper defensive lines to the ball and then creates a free man further forward. But we'll see now how Manchester City used players like Gundogan, Bernardo Silva, and Jesus to position them between defenders, like Bernardo Silva, I believe it is, here, moving narrow and taking the fullback of Tottenham with him, and then thus creating space for Sterling. And then, as well as this, we have Gundogan moving narrow to then pull the midfield connections towards the ball as a defensive normally would, shift towards the ball, then creating space on the weak side. So then, remember the positioning of the players between the lines and between defenders horizontally, because in the next picture, this will be important. So then the positioning will then, after a longer switch, will promote progression in 2v1 situations like this against the fullback of Tottenham. And we can even connect them. So the City players, the winger and the strong side attacking midfielder, then have a 2v1 situation because they are playing the blind spot of the Tottenham midfielders. And then this gives them direct access to these danger zones, like the assist zone or the area I've just highlighted, often referred to as the assist zone, and then which can then be super effective for cutbacks in situations like this, but mainly the 2v1 situations. And with the defenders from Tottenham, we can see especially the fullback and the two center backs. So the two center backs aren't physically marking anyone, which will give them a sense of security and the ability to move towards the ball, which will then create space in the mouth of goal for a cutback or a low cross for Manchester City to finish. So now, even though there was a miscontrol from Sterling, we still have our wide structure with Zinchenko in the deeper area, so even when the ball cannot be played into a dangerous position in behind, there is the rest defense structure that allows for the ball to take advantage of the space in front of the opposing team, in front of the opposing team's defensive block, as well as in behind. So if in behind doesn't work, they have players in areas through circulation or to promote a more offensive action while maintaining possession in front of the team's block. So now just a quick look at Tottenham in possession of the ball. Sometimes they would create a back three, which would consist of Højbjerg dropping deeper between two center backs, and this would give them a numerical superiority. Oftentimes it's referred to as a 3v2, but oftentimes it also is described as a 4v2 with the use of the holding midfielder. So when Sissoko came on, he was able to then free up Ndombele to go forward more and assist Højbjerg with trying to maintain circulation and a more defensive presence in the second half. That was the intention behind it, but as we know, it wasn't too effective. So the Manchester City two forwards. And one thing to note was Tottenham's build-up was very vertical, which often became inefficient because of the field of view that the players took and their ability to then just play vertically and not be able to move Manchester City's defense in multiple dimensions. It was very one-dimensional. So, but again, we're looking at the offensive concept from Tottenham. So Sissoko will move in the blind side to try and break the two Manchester City forwards, which he does successfully. So the three players are able to then find Sissoko in the blind spot of the two Manchester City forwards. So moving forward, we see a vertical pass from the Højbjerg, the deeper holding midfielder. And then from here, Sissoko plays another vertical pass because the half spaces were well blocked off, even though Manchester City have players between the lines open that are Tottenham players. So Harry Kane, Ndombele, and Lamela are occupying the space in behind, while players like Son and Lucas Moura would then be making runs in behind. But Lucas Moura was subbed off at halftime, so it was more Son, and then a later run from Lamela would happen to occur to threaten in behind. But then City did a very well job of knowing when their center backs could jump and when they couldn't, and when there was a threat in behind to pin them back. So these vertical passes often were inefficient because the Spurs players had a negative field of view, and they often received these balls under pressure with multiple players around them. So it took a great deal of individual skill to get out of these situations and to make the most of these difficult vertical passes. So now Looking at Manchester City's build-up again, we see the asymmetry created in the players, the inverted fullbacks, and the holding midfielder. And as we mentioned, they play slightly different roles. Although they do invert, Cancelo often inverts quite a bit more, as we see here, forming a double pivot and almost a back three. So a very flexible shape in what they can do with these players. But then, like we talked about at the start of the video, players moving more narrow elicits a wider movement from a player higher up the field. And then now we have Bernardo Silva free, and he is able to become free because of the narrow movement from Cancelo, as well as the pinning of Sterling and the Tottenham fullbacks with the players in behind the holding midfielders of Tottenham to keep the Tottenham holding midfielders pinned towards the center. So really, Manchester City creating a wide player who's the free man through pinning and opposite movements to then obviously hit the mid-range ball of Laporte or Stones to access this player. And now one final look at the structure, Manchester City, and this is the goal. And this is just one example more of the opposite movements like we've been talking about with Gabriel Jesus playing in the blind spot of the defenders, which usually isn't a concern because he's then in an offsides position, but it is still difficult because they would still pay attention to him a bit, and by focusing on him and the ball, it's a losing proposition to be focused on two things at once, which will allow Gundogan, who's positioned between the lines in the blind spot of Sissoko and in front of the center back, and to just leave this player to run from a higher area or from a deeper area in behind. With Ederson on the ball is very dangerous because it causes miscommunication when the player is positioned not in the field of view of the midfielder, and the defender sees him in a bit deeper position to then assume that the midfielder has him. And we can look at Spurs' use of a more man-oriented system. So Spurs' use of a man-oriented system in the high block, as many teams do, we can see it very clearly. So it would be very hard, and it would take a high level of communication for it would take a high level of communication and awareness from Tottenham to understand the situation of the team and who's responsible for what role, where then a deeper run could, like it did here, threaten with just a qualitative matchup and individual one-on-one isolations going in behind, which is a very tough situation to be a part of, but it happened here, and we see the Manchester City setup using Ederson, creating the back three, so he has time and space on the ball because Tottenham didn't want to step out too far and press him, and we have width being created now through Bernardo Silva and Zinchenko, and this is another key feature, Zinchenko and Bernardo Silva. Oftentimes Bernardo Silva, as we saw in the previous clip, moving into a wider position, allowing Cancelo to operate in a more advanced role. And then we have our single pivot in this situation connected to the offensive midfielders, and with Gabriel Jesus frequently dropping between the lines as a false nine. So all in all, the last note is the height and width created by the wingers, which also just made the back line that much deeper, allowing for Gundogan to take advantage of all this space in behind the defense, and essentially score the goal. So that's the last picture, and this was the analysis of Manchester City versus Tottenham. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe to the channel. That's a huge help, and I really appreciate it from everyone. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.